Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to those of you who are here in Rome with us. Good morning to those of you in North America, and good evening to those who are connecting from time zones in Central, East Asia, and the Pacific. My name is David Ainsworth, and I am the Information Officer for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this briefing being held in the headquarters of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. We're holding this in advance of the second meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. As part of the preparations and outreach for this meeting, and also thanks to the assistance of the United Nations Foundation, we're pleased to bring senior officials from the Secretariat of the Convention and the co-chairs and other representatives from other organizations to speak to you this afternoon. Just a quick words about the background. The 14th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity had its meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in 2018, and that's when the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework was appointed, and they appointed Francis Ogwal from Uganda and Basil van Havre from Canada to lead the process as the co-chairs. This working group is mandated to prepare the text of a framework that will guide the work of the Convention after the year 2020. At the working group's first meeting held in Nairobi in August 2019, work was authorized and initiated on a zero draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework for consideration at this meeting, the second meeting of the working group, held in Rome starting on Monday, the 24th of February. In today's briefing, we will be accomplishing a few things. First of all, we will be describing the working group meeting and the negotiations in Rome, which is an important milestone on the road to COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity to be held in China this year. We will also preview discussions on the draft Global Framework Agreement, which was publicly debuted on the 13th of January. We're also happy to have with us, as you can see on the screen, the representative of IPBES, Anne Larigauderie, who's the Executive Secretary. She'll be talking about the best available science and evidence for the negotiations. And then also we'll have an opportunity to outline the upcoming publication, Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which will be released on the 18th of May. The people that will be joining us today, and I'm very pleased to have them, immediately to my left is Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, who is the Acting Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Beside her is David Cooper, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary to the Convention on Biological Diversity. Next to them, we have Basil van Havre, who is from Canada, who is one of the co-chairs for the Open-Ended Working Group on the Post-20 Global Biodiversity Framework. And he is joined by Francis Ogwal, who is the second chair. And then we have on screen Anne Larigauderie, the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBES. She is joining us from Bonn, so we're bringing her in thanks to the grace of technology. So what I'd like to do, with further ado, we'll have about 30 minutes of comments, and then we'll be leaving time for questions from the people here in Rome, as well as questions that are being submitted remotely from press around the world. But let me begin and pass the floor to Elizabeth, who can speak about CBD and the processes to come. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, David, and thank to all media around the world who are joining us this afternoon Roman context. It's a pleasure for me first to be with you all this afternoon, just few days before we begin or when the governments will be meeting here in Rome at the FAO complex for the second session of the working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. First, I would like to take this opportunity to sincerely thank the Director General of Food and Agriculture Organization, Mr. Ki Dong-yu, for his kind offer and willingness to host us for this meeting, and more so for the prompt arrangements made to support us at such a short notice. It has been very important, and it's very important to recognize the enormous efforts being taken also by the government of People's Republic of China to control the outbreak of the coronavirus known as COVID-19. Next week, Monday, here in Rome, we expect to have over 1,000 registered participants representing over 140 countries, numerous indigenous peoples and local communities, private sector, youth, and many other stakeholders with stake in the new Global Biodiversity Framework. They will be here because this will be the beginning of a crucial conversation for people and the planet and our future. The conversation comes at the crucial time in the history of mankind. Why crucial? And I'm sure Anne on the screen will enlighten us more. The recent assessments of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, as well as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, both shows that biodiversity loss, climate change impacts, and land degradation are not only deeply interconnected, but also taking place at an unprecedented scale. We all need to take serious, concerted actions to bring about the world we want and to set global priorities for the what, where, and how to protect biodiversity and the nature. The meeting due to begin next week marks the start of the critical year in our journey, which will lead us also to other meetings of the Convention on Biological Diversity in Montreal in May, leading to the third meeting of the open-ended working group in Colombia in July, also leading to the UN Biodiversity Summit in September, and finally culminate in the adoption of a universal, transformative, and innovative post-2020 global biodiversity framework at our Conference of the Parties in Kunming, China, in October. The meeting starting Monday will base its discussion on the zero draft text of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which was launched on 13th January this year in all UN languages as prepared by our co-chairs, with contributions from all stakeholders over the last 18 months. You will hear directly, of course, from the co-chairs, Basil and Francis, later in this briefing, on the journey they took for the preparation of the draft and its content, and therefore I will not go into detail. However, suffice it to say that the zero draft contains a proposed framework that applies a theory of change approach, a strategic planning framework that will allow diverse stakeholders to work together towards a common goal, use the same language, and ensure collective action. It provides an excellent and solid starting point for our discussions here in Rome. I cannot underline enough the importance of making progress at this meeting. It will be encouraging for the parties to initiate and advance discussions with a focus on building a common understanding of the different elements of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as exploring the scope and key content of the blocks of the framework. I know and I'm aware that the world is eagerly waiting out there for the demonstrable progress towards a clear, actionable, and transformative global framework on biodiversity. We know the world wants a framework that can be implemented at all levels, beginning at national level, regional level, global levels. We also know the world wants a framework that builds upon an expiring global, biodiversity strategic plan, 2011-2020, and its accompanied Aichi biodiversity targets, and a framework that will align with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals. Media messages have also been very clear to all of us because they've been reminding us on the urgency of the challenges before us. Indeed, this is true, but we should also focus on the availability of solutions. We have solutions at hand, in particular the nature-based solutions, and therefore we also know it's not too late to slow, halt, and eventually reverse the alarming trends in the decline of biodiversity and be able to contribute to the sustainable development. But we can only do so through transformative changes involving all stakeholders in the society. I'm confident that the working group, with the engagement of all stakeholders, will produce and deliver the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, the framework we want for the future sustainability for the people and the planet that will enable the world to take steps needed and bend the curve for biodiversity loss. We know that investing in nature is one of the best ways to mitigate and adapt to climate change, is also one of the best ways to restore our natural life support systems, and therefore concrete and concerted actions are an investment that will allow us all to build the future of life in harmony with nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. The work of the convention is based on the best available scientific knowledge that helps inform decision-making. And to that end, we're very pleased to have with us the Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, Anne Larigauderie, connecting to us from Bonn. Anne, can you hear us there?
Yes, I can hear you well, and you too?
Good, perfect, sounds good. So Anne, we invite you to speak to the audience and the ones assembled on the webcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good day to everyone around the world, as well as colleagues in Rome. And as was just mentioned, IBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, synthesizes and evaluates the state of knowledge on biodiversity in a way similar to what IPCC has been doing over the years for climate change. And as everyone will remember, in May 2019, IBES released its global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the summary for policymakers was approved by government in a 45-hour dialogue with the authors of that assessment. And that assessment analyzed over 15,000 scientific publications, as well as other forms of knowledge, and in particular indigenous and local knowledge. And what's important in the context of this discussion here on the post-2020 framework is that that assessment was requested by governments, but it also was requested by the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it was planned strategically so as to be released ahead of this important conversation that we're having now to provide the scientific basis for the thinking about the post-2020, as well as for evaluating progress against the Aichi target. So very quickly, 5 key highlights of the global assessment to refresh our memory. So the first one is that the IBES global assessment found that nature is being degraded at a rate and scale that is unprecedented in human history. And one of the very sad number that has become a bit emblematic of that report is the 1 million species of plants and animals threatened with extinction out of an estimated total of 8 million species of plants and animals. 2 is that this loss in biodiversity is eroding our very own foundation, our life on this planet. It is, for example, affecting the capacity of our ecosystems, to attenuate climate change through the capacity of our forests to absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It is, for example, threatening our pollination services, which allow us to obtain vital crops. 3, the IBES global assessment ranked the direct causes of biodiversity loss. The most important one on land is the destruction and modification of natural ecosystems, such as, for example, through deforestation or urban sprawl. And the main direct causes of biodiversity loss in the ocean is the overexploitation of resources, such as, for example, the unsustainable fishing. Climate change is listed as the third major cause of biodiversity loss, and quickly increasing in importance as climate change becomes more and more exacerbated. And of course, at the basis of all of these direct causes, we have what we call indirect causes, which is all of the values, all of the behaviors, all of the decisions that we make and that create these direct causes of loss of biodiversity. Four, the global assessment made a number of conclusions regarding our internationally agreed goals. It concluded that we will for sure miss the Aichi biodiversity targets when taken together at this coming COP15, and it found good scientific evidence for progress for components of only 4 out of the 20 targets. It also demonstrated clearly the interdependency between biodiversity and many of the sustainable development goals, particularly those related to climate, to food, to water, poverty, and health, and concluded that none of these goals will be reached by 2030 if current trajectories continue and are not modified. And 5, and finally, and very importantly, the global assessment said that it is not too late to act. Solutions exist. Many are not new. In many cases, it's a matter of better deployment and implementation, and everyone can play a role. So governments, of course, who are meeting next week in Rome, have a major role to play, certainly. And one of the key recommendations, which has been taken up in the new biodiversity framework, is this central idea of integrating biodiversity across all economic sectors, in particular agriculture, reducing the use of pesticides or fertilizers, promoting agroecological practices. Another important one is to stop deforestation, promote forest management, ecosystem restoration in order to increase the capacity of our natural ecosystems to absorb carbon from the atmosphere and therefore to help solve the climate crisis. So this is what we call nature-based solutions. Those are win-win strategies in which we can both improve the biodiversity situation as well as the climate change crisis. And perhaps some of the press here in this meeting will have heard President Macron of France last week, who I accompanied. I had the opportunity to hear him say again that biodiversity and climate change are the fight of the century and are indivisible and should no longer be addressed separately. There are many, many other options for action that the global assessment featured, including, and very importantly, the private sector, who will also be very present next week, and the same for the private sector, which would also be invited to integrate biodiversity in their supply chains so as to promote sustainable agricultural practices as well, and also, for example, to buy certified products to avoid deforestation, for example, and also for the finance system, options such as adjusting investments so as to no longer support the deterioration of nature and deforestation, for example. So these are, in a nutshell, some of the key conclusions of the IBES global assessment. The Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 is very much anchored into this scientific assessment of IBES, and as you will see, it also has been a source of inspiration and information for putting together the post-2020 biodiversity framework that will be presented shortly. With this, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Anne, for your comments. Yes, the global assessment last year, very, very important, pointed out the dire situation that we were in, the status of things, but at the same time pointed out that the solutions do exist and that their application is part of the way forward for the biodiversity community. And indeed, the mention of mainstreaming, the importance of having a variety of sectors, and certainly looking at the people participating in our meeting next week, the broad variety and large number from a number of sectors, including the business community, is a sign that this message is getting through. Thanks very much, Anne. Just before David comes up, and I'll ask the technicians to put the slides up for David Cooper, just want to remind the journalists who are watching that you can submit your questions to us at cbdmediaquestions@gmail.com. When you do that at cbdmediaquestions@gmail.com, please include your name and affiliation, and we'll do our best to answer the questions right in this briefing, and then also even follow up afterwards. So now I'd like to turn to David Cooper, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary, and he's going to talk about Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, which is the Convention's own assessment of progress. David?
Thank you very much, David. And yes, I'm going to tell you what to expect from the 5th edition of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which will be launched on May the 18th in Montreal. The GBO5 will essentially provide the background for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that Elizabeth introduced and which the co-chairs will tell you more about in terms of the zero draft. And it will explore ways to realize that vision for 2050 of living in harmony with nature. The 5th edition of the GBO5 will build upon the previous issues of the Global Biodiversity Outlook. It'll draw very much, as Anne has already mentioned, on the IPBES assessments, in particular the 2019 Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, but it will also be enriched by information from the parties to the convention, from the countries, through their 6 national reports. There will be 2 complementary reports, which GBO will also draw upon. One is the Local Biodiversity Outlook, which will contain information on how indigenous peoples and local communities are contributing to the convention. And also the Plant Conservation Report, which will give an update on progress towards the targets under the Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, which is a parallel strategy alongside the general CBD strategic plan. And it will also build upon the research that has come out since that which was used in the IPBES global assessment. So it will include, it will be a document of about 100 pages in 3 main sections. The first section, the introduction, will essentially place the issue of biodiversity, the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity or nature, in the context of sustainable development, the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement, and other major agreements. Then we'll move on to section 2, which will look at the state of biodiversity in 2020. And essentially, what we'll do in this section is provide target by target for each of the Aichi biodiversity targets, which were adopted at COP10 in Nagoya in 2010, a final assessment on progress towards those targets, looking at the achievements, but also looking at the shortcomings and looking at the lessons learned from them. This will build upon the assessment that Anne mentioned just now in the IPBES Global Assessment, and it will have, though, a specific focus on what has happened in the last 10 years compared to the previous 10 years. Then, in a third section of the GBO, we will be looking to the future, essentially building on the scientific work, scientific scenario modeling work. Can we chart pathways towards that 2050 vision? What are the actions that are needed? What's the package of actions that are needed to move towards sustainability? And having after setting out this in general, we'll zoom in on a number of areas where transitions are needed. And these will look at landscapes as a whole, land use change, conservation and restoration activities in landscapes. We'll look specifically at food systems on land in agriculture. We'll look at fisheries, and we'll look at the food systems as a whole, including supply chains and demand by consumers, reducing food waste, this type of thing. We'll also look at cities. We'll look at nature-based solutions to climate change and how climate action can avoid harming biodiversity. And we'll look at the transitions that are needed in freshwater too, freshwater that connects the mountains through the lands to the coastal regions. So essentially what we'll be looking in this section is examples of bright spots, of positive actions which, if scaled up and supported by more transformative economy-wide measures, would support progress and move us towards that agreed 2050 vision. As I mentioned, GBO 5 will be launched on Monday, the 18th of May, at 1 o'clock Montreal time in Montreal, but there will be opportunities, of course, for online involvement, and so media can be accredited for online access, which will include advance access of the GBO, of an embargoed version of the full publication. If you're interested, please register in advance by writing to this email, and we hope to see you in person or online on May the 18th in Montreal. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very, very much, David. And the link for accrediting and following the GBO5 process will indeed be transmitted a number of other times, but we're looking forward to having people follow along. So thank you very much. So we've had the context set for us, the scientific background and the reports that are going to feed into the work. And now we have the pleasure of hearing now about the state of negotiations now and the nature of the text that the governments will be looking at over next week. We'll have a presentation that will be divided by Basile Van Havre and Francis Ogwal. So I think, Basile, you can begin, and you can just use the clicker right there. David can pass the clicker on to you.
We got it.
You can go. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's it right there, yes. Yeah, you can speak. Yeah. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Basile and I will try to give you an update on where we are with the development of the framework. You've already heard a lot from the previous speakers, where we are with biodiversity, and I think at this point in time we shall mainly dwell ourselves on what we are trying to do with the framework now, because I think this framework is one that should give us that hope of taking action to address biodiversity loss. You have heard that it's not too late. We can still do something, but we cannot do something in a disorganized manner. We have to have a framework. So in terms of the framework itself, we have to say this, that globally, business or livelihoods of people is sustained by biodiversity. But I think for some reasons, people think biodiversity loss can happen and their business will continue. Livelihoods might remain the same as it is, but this is not the case. As long as biodiversity loss is happening, it is going to be bad news for business, it is going to be bad news for the economy, it's going to be bad news for everyone, because even the food security of this world will be at threat. So we need to do something. And we have the option of either acting now and in the years to come, or not to act at all. But if we take the path of not acting, given all the statistics we have had, then that means the future is very, very bleak. And therefore, the cost of inaction itself will be higher in future. So those massive losses that you've had is happening means we have to mobilize resources. And often people will say, we don't have resources to tackle this global problem like the one on biodiversity, that there's no money. But ask yourself one question. There are lots and lots of funds being put in subsidies. And therefore, you'd say, if we relocated some of those, if we reprogrammed some of those subsidies into better use of natural sources or nature, that means even the money we are saying not being there is actually there. So it is changing that shift from where we tend to have our goalposts fixed, not wanting to move from there, to where there's sustainability. So we need to move towards a sustainable path. Now, the framework itself is a framework for all. And therefore, that means all of us have to be on board. So it is a framework that is built on science. You've heard about the IP-based report. We have tried our best to build or to craft the zero draft, basing on those, the science that we have had. But also, we have had a lot from consultations. So to guide this process, we had 2 co-chairs designated for this activity, as you've just heard from the executive secretary. That is myself and Basil. So we hope that this framework will give us the opportunity really to come up with something that is very concise, but at the same time it is comprehensive, but also realistic, because we don't want to be unrealistic with the framework. The reality is that we know how things have gone bad. We need to do something. So if you are going to do something, but it must also be realistic, that it must be achievable. If it is not achievable, then that means we've not done ourselves some good work. So it is that delicate balance that we have. We have to be concise, we have to be comprehensive, we have to be realistic with the framework. That is not very easy, but I think with the support of the parties and all stakeholders, we can get there. So this process began with regional consultations, and then it is followed by thematic consultations, and then the negotiations themselves. So those are the broad 3 areas for this framework. And to date, we have completed the part that dealt with consultations. As I said earlier, it is from the consultations that we have, based on, together with the other scientific information, to draft the current zero draft. And followed by that was the first meeting of the Open Working Group that was held in Nairobi in August 2019, that actually gave us the co-chairs the mandate to prepare this zero draft that now we have published. Now, following that, we had an informal briefing last year in November in Canada, in Montreal, where again we did give to the parties and stakeholders how far we had gone as co-chairs between the time we had the first meeting of the Open Working Group to then November, how far we had gone, what had happened. And then from there, we went ahead now to draft this zero draft. And we have also had some thematic consultations that have been carried out. And from then on, we are going to now continue with the second meeting of this working group, which is going to take place next week. But before that, we have now a consultation which is happening on implementation, review, and reporting. And then once we've done the second meeting of the Open Working Group, we are going to go to another thematic consultation, capacity building, that will be followed thereafter by us, the co-chairs, presenting what we have prepared between now and then to Substar at the 24th meeting, and then SBI 3. So we shall probably by then prepare draft 1.0, which will go to the 3rd meeting of the Open Working Group in Cali. That is where probably we shall get almost a very true picture of the framework itself. And then after Cali, we should be good enough to go for COP15 in Kunming.
Thank you, Francis, and good day to all. I will now present to you very quickly the zero draft I'll go to the next slide, which is a representation of the logic model. We'll see that in a second. Here we go. So the vision, you will see it's just a logic organization of what we're trying to accomplish here. We have a vision in the CBD that has been agreed to some time ago, and it is not for negotiation, and it is living in harmony with nature. When we did our consultation, we heard very clearly that parties wanted to have some assurance that the action they would be taking over the next decade will enable to realize that vision. So they needed to know very clearly how those various pieces were articulated. And that meant that we needed to articulate that vision in terms of goals. Goals that could be measured for 2050 with steps for 2030. So you will see that we're providing some goals. At the center of the gray box on the left, you see the action targets. Anne spoke earlier about the 5 causes of biodiversity loss, and when we'll get into the description of the steps, you will see that we try to address those. Below that, you see a box which is about how nature meets people needs. And that is something that is new and that we're introducing in this draft as a response to a very clear request, particularly from developing countries that wanted to see how the second objective of the convention, sustainable use, was to be reflected. In order to carry out all those actions, you will see on the left there is a big box called Tools and Solution, and you will see the detail in there. That is surrounded by means of implementation, enabling condition, and responsibility and transparency. Moving to the next slide, we're going to get now into some of the details. At the center, you will see the text of the goals as presented in the formal document that is submitted to the party. You will see on the right some elaboration of the vision and then a mission statement. Very quickly, and no surprise, you will see goal A, which is around the status of ecosystem, B on species, C on genetic diversity, something that is really important to our colleagues here in FAO. D is around how people needs are met, how people are fed, how do they have access to water, how they're protected from climate change effects. And then E is about access and benefit sharing arising from the use of genetic material. Moving on to the following slide, we're getting into the direct action dealing with biodiversity loss. On the left, you see the 5 causes as listed by Anne a little bit earlier. And on the right, the proposition. Target 1 and 2 are related to land use change. And then the first one is related to retaining and restoring ecosystem. The third element in that is the introduction of a new piece, which is around the notion of land use plan as a tool for protecting land. And then as a first milestone, the proposal is for 50%. Target 2 is a successor to a very famous targets in the previous system. You have all heard about the 17% protected and conserved land and 10% from marine. The introduction here is proposing for 30% for both land and sea. In addition, we're proposing 2 additional criteria. One is a third of that 30% or 10% under stricter or more stringent protection. And also a qualification of the quality of the land protected. And that's the 60% milestone on important biodiversity area. Obviously, this is a percentage that could be raised as we go. Target 3 is on invasive species. Target 4 has raised a little bit of attention in the media. This is one around pollution, and we choose to highlight 3 elements. Biocides, which includes pesticide, nutrients, and plastic. Those are the 3 top priorities from the IPBES assessment. Target 5 is making harvest sustainable and trade sustainable. Target 6 also gathered some attention. It is related to how what we call nature-based solution, which is how nature and the decision we can take around nature can help with mitigation of climate change. Researchers are telling us that up to 37% of the objective in terms of mitigation and carbon reduction can be done through climate change. These targets is suggesting that we can do a large part of that in the next 10 years with 30%. Following slides deal with how nature helps people meet people's needs. First one is around food security, nutrition, and reducing human-wildlife conflicts, and that's something that is really important. Target 8 is around the broader activities taking place on the landscape, agriculture, forestry, fisheries. How do those activities enable to reach people's needs? Target 9 is access to clean water, focusing on nature-based solution. So we're not talking here about purification plant and those things, but how protecting nature enables access to water. Target 10 is new, and it is about a lot of us living in urban environment and how nature contributes to health and well-being, and how access to nature is important to people. Target 11 is again around access and benefit sharing. Now, one of the last part of the core of the system is around the tools and solution, and you heard earlier in the talk about the importance of incentive and eliminating negative subsidies. That's target 12. Targets 13 and 14 relate to what we call in our jargon mainstreaming, and how biodiversity will be included in the various decisions governments are taking, or private sector, companies, industries. Target 15 is around making resource available. We can have the best possible plan, but if this plan is not matched by resource, it will only be a plan. Target 16 is around the protecting nature and people from new technology like biotechnology, from the risk of that. Target 17, which should be read together perhaps with 20, is around people choice. Every day, consumers, citizens make choice. Those choices have implications for nature. How do we influence those choices, driving toward a sustainable consumption, distribution, and production? Target 18 is around the generation of knowledge, the use of knowledge, with a particular focus on the traditional knowledge held by indigenous people and local communities. Target 19 is the important role that this group, indigenous people and local communities, play into conservation. And target 20 is around how do we define our future? What do we define as success for the future? Is there a different way to look at that? Around all that, there is a large part of a number of enabling conditions, and we've only discussed one. Or here's the summary before we get there. On one page here, you see the 20 targets and the 4 goals organized in the same schematic, and that's a good one-page word of view of the system. Finally, a few words around outreach, awareness, and education, which is something that is particularly of interest and the reason why we wanted to talk to you. And all that system will be effective if we're able to implement it. We may have government will, we may have resources. If people will is not there, it's not going to happen. So definitely a very important part of the system. So that completes my part of the presentation, and I'll pass it back to Francis for the 2 last slides.
Thank you, Co-Chair. As we wind up the presentation, this second meeting of the Open and Working Group here in Rome has attracted a number of delegates. We expect over 1,000, and I think that it itself shows you the interest that is in this framework. And among the parties to the CBD, we have so far 135, but the number could be more. And we have hundreds of non-state actors. We have representatives of the business community here. It will be basically about 5.5 days. And we are going to begin focusing on the negotiation of the zero draft. So we have got very good attendance coming up for this zero draft, and I think that is very encouraging for us, the co-chairs. That is what we are looking to. That's what we want to see, that people are participating in this framework. I think that is it from us. The date for COP15 is there on the screen. You see it is from 15th to 28th October in Kunming, China. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Thanks to both you, Francis and Basile, for your work and for your presentation today. As you take your seats, we'll get ready for some questions. We've got questions that have been submitted by people who are watching this on the webcast. and I'll be turning to some of those. But also, if there are reporters in the room who have questions to ask, that as well. I'm going to start first with a question online, and maybe I can have the technicians then bring a microphone to the colleague of Thomson Reuters following. I'm going to start with a question that comes from Laure Filon. She's an environment reporter for Agence France Presse out of Paris. And this question, actually, I'm going to turn this to, I guess, the co-chairs first, but then some of the others can turn on it. First of all, Laure says, well, you know, in the context of you're talking about what's happening next week, what are the major issues of the negotiations that will be covered over the next week? So, Francis and Basile, can you give us a quick outline of how that's going to stack up?
Thank you, and it's always a pleasure to work with our colleagues, Laure Fillon. In terms of the issues for next week, I think next week is a time to focus on the core targets around the threats to biodiversity. We've had a number of thematic consultations, so we've been gathering the experts for the 190 parties and deep diving into land use planning, into ocean conservation, into restoration issues. So target 1 to 6 will be the focus of the discussion next week. There is no doubt in my mind that targets 1 and 2 around what we do about the land use change will gather a lot of attention. I'm sure there will be good ideas coming from participants. At this point in time, our role, Francis and I, is to explain the framework that we've put in April, not to defend it. If at the end of the week the solution is better and as found through the discussion, I'll be the happiest man, and I'm sure Francis will be too. So we hope that the focus will be on those targets. We have a third meeting coming up in July in Cali, in Colombia, and that may be the place where the other targets could be looked at. Francis?
Yes, in addition to what my co-chair said, the other area where we expect the discussion to focus on also are the 5 goals, because definitely those targets are linked to the goals. You implement the targets to get to the goals, and from the goals, then you get to the long-term vision of 2050. So those 5 goals in the zero draft, we also expect that the discussion will happen around them.
Great, thank you very, very much. Maybe I'll just turn to Elizabeth. Just one quick comment on the negotiations coming forward this week.
I think the negotiators will also want to really see the evidence of the linkage between the targets and the goals and the Sustainable Development Goals 2030. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to a question here in Rome now. We have from Thomson Reuters, Finlay Wynne. Would you ask, please?
From the Thomson Reuters Foundation, thank you. Basil and Francis, you do talk about the fact that you were going to focus just now on target 1 to 6, but I do want to raise a point on a slightly the target lower down, because, and this has to do with the target 16, which is about the access and I think that's 11, access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. I think you know that last year there was a open-ended meeting as well as a renegotiation or talking about the seed treaty on the plant genetic resources, and there were major disagreements with regards to the use of digital sequence information. And when that meeting ended with slightly bad feelings, from what I could see, was the fact that they were hoping the CBD to be the one to guide the seed treaty on this. And there was a lot of developing countries that are really hoping to get some sort of an answer from this. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And first, we would like them to focus on 1 to 6 and a couple others, but we're not going to block any discussion. We're totally conscious that finding a solution on the issue of digital sequencing information will be a condition of success. There is a lot of attention. There is a very good process taking place over the next few months. We will have that as part of the formal negotiation at the next meeting. At this point in time, we felt it was good to provide some safe, informal room for discussion, and that is taking place next week as well as in future meetings. So signals are that people are talking to each other, they're developing some innovative solution, and I'm looking forward to being engaged formally in that discussion.
Yes, just to add to what my co-chair has said, of course, for some of the other targets that we may not have yet made reference to, is because there are still other consultations going on, like the one on capacity building. We are having now one on implementation reporting. So even on DSI, eventually, by the time we get to Cali, we should have had that consultation completed, so we could then have this text better done then. But as my co-chair said, we just wanted to have a placeholder for stakeholders out there to know that we are not forgetting the issue of access and benefit sharing. Because if some didn't see it, it would also have been an issue at this point in time.
And just to note that process that Francis refers to, there's a process that was established by the last conference of the parties in Sharm el-Sheikh. So in Montreal, from the 17th of March, there will be a technical expert group that's looking in detail at this issue of DSI. It will be working on the basis of a number of studies that have been commissioned, looking at the different concepts involved, looking at how DSI is currently used, including through databases and the like, and also looking at the current practice among countries in terms of policy and legislation on DSI, so that that technical expert group will be trying to then distill some lessons that will then enable the third meeting of the working group in the last week of July in Cali to look at this in an informed way. But certainly, we, as Basile also said, we recognize that this will have to be a key part of the package that goes to Kunming.
Great, thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn to a question that we've got online from Émilie Legendre of AEF Info. The question we have is, how will the post-2020 framework ensure that states will be liable or accountable from now on? I think I'll turn to the Executive Secretary, Elizabeth, for that.
Thank you very much. I think we need to remember that the new framework is building upon and learning lessons from the current strategic plan as well as the Aichi targets. Where we have failed to reach the targets, then those lessons are being built into the new framework. So in terms of how do we ensure states will be liable, as the co-chairs have indicated, there are consultations going on to build on, for instance, this week, the monitoring, review, accountability mechanism is being discussed, which will be part of the framework. And this is where then the parties, member states, and all stakeholders will be committed to the review and monitoring mechanism. What will also be important, again, learning from the past, is the means of implementation. Again, is a component which for now is only a placeholder on it, because discussions are still continuing in terms of capacity building, technical cooperation, and the like. And these will be the means to really get the stakeholders be committed to the implementation and report with a monitoring mechanism. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to move to another question because we are for time here. This is from Alok Gupta, who's the environment editor for the China Global Television Network in Beijing. And so Alok's question is, since the meeting has been moved to Rome because of the COVID-19 outbreak, how is the convention ensuring China's participation? And maybe Elizabeth and David can take that and talk about China's participation in this meeting.
So certainly there will be a delegation from China, headed, I believe, by the Deputy Permanent Representative from the UN Environment Programme in Nairobi, who actually happens to be a former focal point of China to the CBD. So we will have, I'm sure, a very active and informed Chinese delegation here in Montreal. In Rome. We're in Rome.
We travel so much we forget where we are, don't we? Yes, exactly. Good. Okay. Excellent. Great. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to turn to a question we've received from Megan Rowling, who's the climate correspondent for Thomson Reuters Foundation. And she's asking if we could elaborate on what is meant by protected areas. And she says, for which some are suggesting the target should be 30% of land and sea. Her question is, when we look at protected areas, what are we talking about in terms of human activities that are allowed, not in those areas, and what kind of areas would be included? And so I guess maybe I'll have the co-chairs provide a little bit of a background to that, and then the colleagues from the Secretariat. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a very useful question to come back and talk about how decisions are made on land. And if you allow me, I'll step back one step and talk about how we manage 100% of the land. And that's what is meant into Target 1 by looking at how we're going to be moving from a system. In part of the world, there is a very good system about making decision on land use based on sustainability and long-term conservation needs. Within a portfolio of land, you have the land at the core. There is protected hard protection land or more stricter protection land, what in some part of the world we call our national park networks and things like that. Around that, there is usually a zone where there is some restriction on the type of activities that people can do. Yet there is some biodiversity benefits, and that can take many different forms. And then around that further, there is also the zone that are used for production, agriculture, forestry, fishery, and then finally zones that are used for urban development, exploitation, etc. I think governments are looking and decision makers are looking at that whole range of issues. The previous target was focusing with the 17% and the 10% on land that is protected and conserved. And what is meant by conserve is land where there is some level of economic activities taking place, yet there is a biodiversity benefit. We're raising that to, we're proposing that this be raised to 30%, and we're putting some additional boundaries around that. And then the definition that we're using are definitions that are adapted in each country, but are coming from definitions that are coming from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is widely recognized as the authority for those kind of policy. Francis?
Yes, in addition to what Basil has just said, of course, protected areas, usually they are put in place by an instrument of gazettement that will definitely ensure its integrity over a long time. So an area to be really declared or be made a protected area, there has to be an instrument that has gazetted it as such. So those are some of the issues that would qualify a place to be protected area in addition to what Basil has just said. Of course, there's been this transition from protected area from very strict approach maybe in the past to where now you have to really try to balance up how the same area is going to provide benefits to people, going to provide benefits to the global community, because some of those protected areas could, for example, be a water catchment, and for which the benefit is beyond national jurisdiction. It goes to other countries. So these protected areas are not necessarily even only for the areas or the countries for which they are designated, but the benefits goes far beyond. And for most cases, they generate what we famously call global benefits. They are benefits for everyone. And so they're like the last refuge, really, for biodiversity.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we're going to quickly wrap up. I've got two more questions, and I'm going to be directing these to... sorry, Anne wants to speak. Sorry, can we have the sound for Anne? And sorry, go ahead, Anne, please.
Just very quickly on this important issue of protected areas. The global assessment of IBES spoke about the percentage of areas, and one of the key conclusions was that it is not, of course, enough to only focus on the percentage of area under protection, but it will also really be key to include an indication of management effectiveness of these parks, because quite often an area is declared as under protection, but then there is no real enforcement of any rules, and so protected areas correspond to very different realities, from real protection to only what we call paper park, where there is very little action. So, I believe that this target 1, as it is now, captures this with this idea of connectivity, integrity, areas of wilderness, but that part will be really important to monitor and to keep as part of the target, and not only to focus on the percentage. So it is to be understood as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Anne. I'm going to turn to a question received from Christian Schweigerl, who is with Riffraff Reporters, which is a collective of environmental reporters out of Germany. I'm going to turn this one to Elizabeth, but then I may bring a question back to Anne here a little bit. So Christian's question, Elizabeth, for you is, what would be the consequence of a failure of the Kunming Conference to achieve this 2020 global framework?
We do not expect a failure. That's number one. And if at all that we are beginning to think of the consequences, then the message from the recent reports, IPBES, IPCC, has not sunk into us, where we have been told the biodiversity loss has reached the unprecedented level in the history of humankind. And therefore, consequences of failure, what we'll be saying is there will be no humanity beyond that, both for our lives and the planet. So we don't want to think of consequences. We are all out to make sure we succeed, including yourself, media. You have a role to play.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth. I'm going to just move with one more final question. Actually, I'm going to turn to Anne for this one here. So you said in your initial remarks when you're looking at the global assessment that there were signs of hope, and we'll talk about this in GBO5 later on this year too. But what signals give you personally even the greatest optimism that we can stop the degradation of nature and that we can live in harmony with nature by 2050?
Right, so perhaps a couple. One of them is I believe, together with the EBES Global Assessment, but the work of CBD and others, in 2019, we really reached a really unprecedented level of awareness regarding biodiversity. And I can see that the idea of biodiversity is really gaining in importance in many different sectors of society. One encouraging element is, and as was mentioned, I believe, by David, the Davos World Economic Forum risk report, which ranks biodiversity loss now as one of the 5 key risks to businesses, and is now really triggering a wealth of activities from business and industries, not waiting for government action, but really seizing the issue of biodiversity the way they are now seizing and making their own the climate change issue. So business and biodiversity is moving in, and we can also see the youth moving in, and also now not only demonstrating, but also making proposals, no longer only on climate change, but now really making this strong association between climate change and biodiversity. And you are also starting to see demonstrations on the issue of biodiversity as well, meaning a really unprecedented awareness, which is always something that is necessary to trigger action. So those would be some evidence, perhaps, of a greater awareness and of optimistic aspects for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Elizabeth, I'm going to give you an opportunity to provide a few comments, then I think we'll have to close it up. Thanks.
I think it's important also to see that this year, which we call Super Year for Biodiversity, and there are reasons why we are calling Super Year, virtually all levels of society, all stakeholders are involved in the process for the development of the new framework, which has not been the case in the history of the convention. So the fact that we have all stakeholders on board, the youth, the business, private sector, NGOs, clearly indicate all human beings have a role to play in the new framework. And therefore, with that, there is a lot of optimism, also of success, because we have seen there might be no life beyond this century if we are not careful.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. We'll have to go. We're a little bit over time. The negotiations begin Monday morning. I guess at 10 o'clock is when we'll have the opening ceremony. Please note that the plenaries of the negotiations next week will all be webcast here on the FAO webcast channel, and we'll also have links on the website of the Convention of Biological Diversity. They'll be available live and then also in on-demand later. We will have a closing press conference, broadcast webcast on the 29th of February. Any reporters who are here in Rome or who would like to attend the meetings, please get in touch with us for accreditation and we can arrange your availability on site and certainly any interviews with anyone else. For any questions we didn't manage to answer during this time, we will be sending you answers via email. So thank you everyone for your time, and I wish you all a good afternoon and a great weekend.